Hi, it's Nick here from Vegans Be the Change. On Wednesday, the 22nd of May, I'm sitting in my garden, my beautiful garden here in Devon, enjoying the lovely, warm, early summer's day. And I just wanted to have do a little broadcast about an extraordinary story that came out of Canada yesterday, which brings up a lot of fascinating issues. At least I think so. And I think it brings into really sharp focus some of the difficulties that people promoting veganism bring out in others. So this story from Canada has to do with a chap called Adam Nauf. Well, I hope that's how you pronounce his name. It's Knauff. Apologies to Mr. Nauf if I pronounced his name wrong. But he's filed a complaint with his employers for breach of human rights. So what happened? Who is he and how did this arise? Well, he's a firefighter from Ontario in British Columbia. That's that beautiful stretch of state on the west coast where Vancouver is, absolutely stunning, beautiful place. And in 2017, there were some terrible wildfires there, and it arose out of that. And he claims that his human rights were violated, his legal human rights were violated because he wasn't given vegan food during this episode. So he's now filed a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal in Ontario against his employers, who are the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So he alleges that his human rights were violated because he wasn't provided sufficient vegan food whilst battling this huge, massive blaze in British Columbia, near Williams Lake in 2017. So what he said was, and I quote, "The Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry discriminated against me and failed to accommodate my sincerely held ethical beliefs, a creed, when it failed to provide me with food that accommodated my personal commitment to ethical veganism, and then disciplined me and suspended me because I attempted to assert my right to accommodation of that sincerely held ethical belief." That's what he's written in the application to the tribunal. Now, the ministry obviously goes without saying they've denied his allegations of discrimination and human rights violations. One would expect that. So that the legal case centers around whether or not veganism is a form of creed. The definition of that was expounded on by the Human Rights Tribunal in Ontario in 2015 to include non-secular beliefs. So non-secular beliefs, in other words, some kind of religious or spiritual belief. It's a very interesting question, no doubt about it. Now, he was based in Ontario. He worked with the ministry since 2008, and he was often dispatched outside the province. And he's filed a complaint based on the grounds that his creed wasn't accommodated. Now, what he said in his application was, again, I'll read this, quotes, "I'm an ethical vegan in that I not only follow a vegan diet, but I extend the philosophy of non-consumption of animal products to all other areas of my life. I do not think that humans have the moral right to oppress other beings or to cause them pain and suffering." Now, I'm fairly sure that most people listening to this will wholeheartedly agree with that. So he arrived in northern British Columbia on July the 15th, 2017, and he was one of about 1,000 firefighters battling this massive forest fire. He was working 14 to 16 hours a day. Now, obviously, this is grueling and very demanding physical work. And, I think firefighters are one of those professions that have all of our respect. It's grueling, it's demanding, and wow, what a job. Now, in this case, that was a massive outbreak of fire, and the Prime Minister went and visited the area at the time. It was a real disaster. So 10,000 homes rather, were evacuated in Williams Lake, and the only store open was a Tim Hortons store that the police were running, which was quite some way away. Tim Hortons, interesting, he'd been in the news the other day because it's introducing some meatless sausage breakfast patties, which are from Beyond Meat, and that caused their shares to rise the other day when Beyond Meat got the contract for that. Anyway, Tim Hortons is now promoting this, ironically enough, but it wasn't in 2017. Now, he said in the deposition that the ministry had long known about his dietary constraints, and he'd filled out a standard food information form for the trip. And he said, on some days during my deployment to Williams Lake, I wasn't provided with any food that was vegan or not otherwise contaminated with animal products, and therefore forced to go hungry. Now, the fact that there was the chefs and the people producing the food didn't go out of their way to make sure there was no cross-contamination and do everything separately was something he objected to. And the fact that that didn't happen and he's complaining about it is a source of enormous amount of mickey taking out of him. And the great hordes of people who love to take the mickey out of vegans have just been on and on about this, as you would expect. So anyway, he says he was forced to go hungry. Then on July the 16th, he ate salad and side dishes. And then the next day, he wrote, there were no vegan meals, so he ate plain bagels and coffee from Tim Hortons. And the day after that, he was given beans, oatmeal, and fruits. So what he's saying is after working 16-hour days for 4 days with inadequate nutrition, he began to feel physically ill and mentally groggy. Well, I bet he did. I mean, I would, that's for sure. If I'm doing that intense physical work, no question about it. So until that point, he'd been trying to push through his hunger and exhaustion, sustaining himself on just nuts and fruits. Who would want mentally and physically groggy people fighting fire and potentially saving lives in the environment and wildlife? I mean, it's bonkers, isn't it? Anyway, he complained to his supervisor, who said he'd work on it, according to the documents. And then on July the 20th, apparently the only source of protein in his dinner was a single black bean. It doesn't quite make sense to me. He got one bean. I find that a bit strange. But anyway. And then the next 2 days he had inadequate dinners, he says. So he asked for the personnel to buy some tofu for him during the service runs, and he got 3 boxes of tofu. He gave it to the camp chef, but he never saw it again, apparently. They were obviously too badly organized or under too much pressure to cope with one person out of 1,000 or whatever it was. Anyway, things came to a head on the 23rd of July. He was looking forward to a big barbecue dinner where there'd be vegan burgers. And the chef handled the beef patties before touching the vegan patties with the same gloved hands. So he swore at the chef, who swore back, and he got a warning from the supervisor. And his complaint, he says, nobody seemed to take his ethical beliefs seriously. And then the next day, he had some stir fry with no protein. He was promised beans, and he took his plate to the supervisor and asked if he could see any protein, and the supervisor offered him some protein bars. He was upset, and then he swore. Now, he says, obviously he knows he shouldn't have sworn, but he was starving, exhausted, humiliated, and defeated. I can well understand he was starving and exhausted. The feelings of humiliation and defeat obviously stem from his genuine belief in his ethical veganism. So he poured the food out in front of the food staff and said, this isn't vegan. And then he got sent home, and he was suspended for 3 days without pay for his inappropriate, insubordinate, unprofessional, and aggressive behavior. He was banned for fighting fires outside the province for the rest of 2017 and the whole of 2018. So he's been seriously humiliated. And the ministry say that he threw the non-vegan food at the staff, which Mr. Nauf denies. So, I'm quite sure that the base camp that they set up was very difficult for all involved, as they were trying to feed 1,000 firefighters with the closest towns with open stores hours away. And so the ministry, his employers, are saying that his vegan status, yes, it's a sincerely held lifestyle choice, but it doesn't meet the legal definition of a creed. And it further argues that it supported him and accommodated his food restrictions as if it was a component of his health needs or part of a recognized creed. So, is this a creed? Is this like a religious creed? Is that what veganism is? Is that what it has to be to have people take it seriously on behalf of the people who believe this? And sure, there's a spiritual dimension to it when you take animal suffering into account. when you go into Tibetan Buddhism and the way they will walk over, that they will go out of their way to not step on an ant, that's a spiritual belief, ultimately. Anyway, the executive director of an advocacy group called Animal Justice out there in Canada, called Camille Lebchuk, said that it hopes to intervene in the case because veganism in the workplace isn't just limited to this chap. And as she says, ethical veganism has never been ruled as a form of creed. So this is effectively a test case. And it'll be important to have a clear statement from the tribunal. So it'll be very, very interesting to see how that one shapes up. A legal test case on whether this is a non-secular creed. You know, it's not necessarily that easy. I mean, I have my sympathies. I'm sure that you watching have your sympathies. But where does one draw the line? It's not always that obvious. You're fighting a fire in the middle of nowhere, and it must be damn difficult just focusing on that. But obviously, there's a whole infrastructure there. They have to feed and sleep and provide latrines for the firefighters and all the rest of it. And they're probably just about getting by. And of course, we live in an age where the vast majority of people really don't understand veganism. And bearing in mind there's only one open store, and that was a few hours away. Not easy. But what I found extraordinary about this is I've been scouring the Canadian press and the articles written about this, and looking at the comments of the Canadians replying to this. And I couldn't find anybody who had an ounce of sympathy for it. It was unanimously treating it with contempt. Presumably the people leaving reviews on these newspaper sites are the same kind of people that love mocking vegans. And I'm sure you know exactly what I mean and the type of people that I'm referring to. So here's just a few of the responses that people have said about him. And I'll just skim through some of these quickly. It gets a bit boring after a while because it gets very repetitive and samey. But people are saying that, the big complaint about the fact that the cross-contamination, that the chef was using the same equipment to deal with the meat in his food. They're just mercilessly taking the mickey out of him for that. And of course there's going to be cross-contamination. Well, maybe not. It depends on your system of food production. Certainly if you take a little bit more care, I'm sure it can be dealt with. But they're just taking the mickey. Oh, how horrible, the poor man. They're just really, that's the general tone of it. People are saying that he's just using the media to draw attention to his cause. They're having a go. They're presuming that he was wearing leather gloves and boots. And they're saying, you're the anomaly. Stay behind. If you can't, if you can't stand the heat of the kitchen, get out of the heat of the kitchen. Get out. Can't remember the exact thing, but you know what I mean. Just stay out of the kitchen. Just don't do it. You're an anomaly. You're not the norm. So shove it. Basically, is what these comments are saying. And this is what's wrong with Western society's pandering to every single minority demand to accommodate this, and society seems to be going along with it. A lot of mockery of this. And there's an interesting parallel. I mean, one person was saying, well, what happens if there's a single soldier on the front line demanding vegan meals during a major military campaign? Would the military be obliged to accommodate such a request as well? And then for this guy to have the nerve to expect his delicate sensibilities to be personally accommodated, and then they insult, making various insults, is beyond the pale. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, if you're out in a war where humans are killing humans, the idea of animals being spared this violence is a very interesting philosophical question. And there was quite recently, I wrote a piece about the Fort Sill military base in Oklahoma, which apparently was the first military base in the US where, according to the US military independent news source Stars and Stripes, said that there was, they were now providing at all times vegan options for the soldiers there. And one of the comments I made when I wrote about it was, who knows where this homeopathic dose of kindness and compassion might lead. It's an interesting thought that a military base is providing vegan options. Anyway, yeah, I mean, where do you extend it? In a war, where the troops are out killing other human beings, somebody's got a vegan, ethical vegan worldview. Interesting, that person on the front line, but anyway, that's for another discussion. And people are saying he's a narcissist, just thinking of himself, and moaning about the limitless rights of constitutional rights for human rights. And they're saying that the forefathers who set up Canada be turning in their graves, this kind of thing. So it just goes on, and it's the same. It's all the same. And some very hysterical reactions. Here's one: I live next to those bases. I'm sure that the Ontario Human Rights will give a special charter to Vancouver to send his groceries in by air flight, and it's very expensive, and I wouldn't have done it. I'd thank him for his services and tell him to go home, and I wouldn't deploy him again in a fire like that. It's a very hysterical reaction. And then people are asking, well, where do you draw the line? Are you going to go and provide for halal meat, kosher meat, if people have another non-secular, genuinely held belief? If you accept one ethical, genuinely held belief, do you accept them all? Do you objectively say one is okay and another isn't? These are delicate issues, and the answer isn't really obvious, and you have to really think about these things very, very, very closely. But what I found amazing is there's not a single person in all of these comments who give them any sympathy at all. So is the right to vegan food a human right? I mean, I've often thought, I've had my own issues about the human rights legislation. I don't really like it being used for what I consider to be relatively trivial things. I've always thought human rights are really important things, like the right to clean water and so on and so forth. But I wouldn't draw that line here. I don't think it's trivial at all. And of course, it's interesting to talk about human rights in the context of animals, because animals aren't humans, but we talk a great deal about animal rights. None of the people making the comments in the Canadian press had any notion of that at all. But what strikes me is, we live in a world where there's so much division and there is so little empathy here. It's quite staggering. I mean, how hard would it be to provide proper food with protein for a guy who's been busting his backside doing 14 to 16 hours a day of the most intensely grueling physical work, saving lives, saving wildlife, saving habitats, saving the environment? I mean, my first reaction is people owe him a debt of gratitude, not ridicule. It's absurd. And, on the other hand, maybe he should have known it would have been tough back in 2017 to have proper food. He could have taken some protein bars from his locker at work, which he could have had there for emergencies. And, it could have been a reasonable way to avoid. Would that have been a reasonable way to avoid all this? Maybe if he'd been fighting the fire for one day, but this was several days, 14, 16-hour days. And nobody should be forced to endure that kind of physical exhaustion and intense demands for days on end without proper rest and food. It's ridiculous. But what I am 100% sure of is that these exact same circumstances wouldn't happen in 10 or 20 years' time. No way. Quite apart from anything else, that was 2017. Now, today in 2019, the one store available was Tim Hortons, which has just announced that it's taking on Beyond Meat's sausages, meatless sausages, patties. So actually, if it happened today, maybe they'll be able to get some of the Tim Hortons sausages there for him. But right now, in 2019, is the provision of vegan food a basic human right? And again, I'm talking about humans from the perspective of the human, not from the perspective of the animal, because that's not, however much people watching this broadcast might want the tribunal court to consider the animal's perspective, it's not going to. It's not in its remit for this particular case. And if we give a duty of care, if there is a duty of care to Mr. Nouse, where does it end? Is it proportionate and reasonable to give him this human right? And it's a very interesting dilemma for the Canadian Employment Tribunals to wrestle with. And it is an interesting question. I don't have a total answer for it. And obviously, I have a real sympathy for the question. And I do know that if I was the lawyer arguing this before the Human Rights Tribunal, I'd give it a hell of a shot. good one too. I really would, and it would be fun. I would really give everything. I know where my sympathies lie, and I know which way the wind's blowing, but I don't think that means it's a guarantee that that's a result that I or people watching this would actually want. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. I found that story absolutely extraordinary. It brought so many issues up. The legal issue of, the rights of vegans, right to the forefront. I mean, when you have a law and you say it's a human right, you have to look at, real extreme cases. It's one thing to talk about schools and providing vegan meals for school children, and it's a good thing, and it's happening more and more and more. But if you're going to say it's a human right, then you've got to apply it when you're a firefighter with 1,000 firefighters trying to put out wildlife fires in the middle of nowhere, working 16 hours a day, and you've got an unbelievable, almost military operation trying to deal with this. Can you justify that kind of imposition of a right for him to be catered for? I know what I hope that the tribunal comes up with. We'll wait and see. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. If you have any comments, please do let me know. Any ideas about this, anything you'd like to say about it, please do let me know. I should be writing about this issue in due course. And any comments you have, I'd love to read them, and it would certainly inform me and make my piece about this a lot better informed and a lot better, for sure. Thanks very much. Bye. If I knew where to turn it off. Here we go. Bye.